All right, welcome back to sleep. We are going to talk about sleep today and kind of how strange it is. So, the average human lives 79 years roughly, and we sleep approximately 26 years of that. So, I mean, it's kind of a strange thing. I mean, everybody kind of takes sleep for granted. I think it's a weird state of consciousness where we just voluntarily kind of lose our ability to experience life. And you kind of imagine, like, we kind of take it for granted because everybody does it. But if you were some kind of species that didn't need to sleep and you came to Earth and you realized that we are sleeping for like a third of our lives or whatever, I think that it would be kind of strange. And sleep is a really interesting brain state when it comes to the nervous system and how the nervous system is, more or less regulating sleep and why we even need sleep. So it's kind of an interesting topic. And the first thing to talk about sleep is endogenous rhythms. So endogenous rhythms are essentially things that are fluctuating, normal like biological states that fluctuate on some kind of given time period. So we have a lot of bodily processes that fluctuate across days, months, or years. And some example of endogenous rhythms are a menstrual cycle, mood changes across seasons, or birds migrating in anticipation for seasonal change. Endogenous rhythms that fluctuate within the day or have a approximately 24-hour cycle are called circadian rhythms. And some examples of those are sleep-wake patterns, body temperature, growth hormones, stress hormones. And you will need to know what circadian rhythms are, what endogenous rhythms are, and an example of an endogenous rhythm, or an example of a circadian rhythm, rather. Circadian rhythms are generated in the absence of normal context and environment. So this was an experiment here. This is data from an experiment, rather, where they took some animals and they removed all external cues from the environment where the animal was. And we can see here that they still had a normal kind of sleep-wake pattern where the time that they were awake, the hours that they were awake, rather, were maintained across the days, but it did shift over time. So essentially what this goes to show you is that although obviously we have certain patterns that are mediated in some way by our external environment, your body is still going to generate these endogenous patterns or influences that are either putting you to sleep or waking you up, or, like again with some of these other examples, the menstrual cycle or birds migrating. It's like this is something that's kind of, out of your control and not due to external influences. And you can force yourself into a different sleep-wake pattern like they did with these animals, but also there are some examples of where if you are changing your sleep-wake patterns, consciously, or forcing yourself to be awake when you would otherwise be asleep, you can have moderate or severe outcomes. So there's some examples with these Martian engineers where they had a robot on Mars and they had trouble adapting to the Martian day, which is 24 hours and 39 minutes. So even adapting to like a 39-minute change kind of caused these Martian engineers to have sleep disturbances. So they had to be essentially on call looking at this Martian robot and trying to adapt to the Martian day, which is only a 39-minute difference from the Earth day, caused some consequences for them. And submarine workers, in this kind of observational study, it was even worse, where they tried to change essentially their patterns so that they were working for 6 hours, 6 hours for leisure, and 6 hours for sleep. So they tried to have 18-hour long days instead of 24-hour long days. And basically this just caused people to have a lot of trouble adapting to this. They would be sleepy when they're supposed to be awake and awake when they're supposed to be sleepy. So, fighting those biological rhythms or those endogenous rhythms are not something that's easily done. And so, it's pretty constant that people who have a graveyard shift or swing shift have kind of some significant health outcomes in a negative way, because they are frequently not sleeping very well. So some more examples of circadian rhythms are hunger, thirst, liver activity, insulin secretion, intestinal activity, even DNA repair, and your body temperature. And this is something that's directly relevant to sleep, is your body temperature. So we have rectal temperature here and hours from sleep onset. And you can see that once you're getting close to sleep, your body temperature starts to plummet. So your body temperature fluctuates throughout the day, normally from 36 degrees Celsius to 37 degrees Celsius. And as you're getting closer to sleep, then your body temperature starts to decrease. So that's why it's sometimes hard to sleep in the summer, especially if you don't have air conditioning. So circadian rhythms are also important for mood. This is something that's also highly affected by your daily rhythm. Individuals tend to have the most positive mood from waking until late afternoon, with a decline towards bedtime. And this was not due to just being able to sleep, but also the time of day that the people were awake. So in this study, they had individuals stay awake for 30 straight hours, starting at 10 a.m. or 5 p.m. So they also varied the time of day where the study started, or when the study started. And pretty reliably, individuals had a more pleasant mood around 5 p.m. Compared to 5 a.m. And this was in an environment that had no external cues. So they just had like some normal lighting in a room, and basically people were more cranky at 5 a.m. compared to 5 p.m. So that is also kind of showing that your internal mood state is kind of going to go on the circadian rhythm, where your endogenous rhythms or your biological rhythms are, affecting your internal states. So although we have this internal clock that's kind of regulating things, you could see from this experiment here that the animals started to drift in an interesting way. So if you have no external cues, your body will still regulate the ebb and flow of various hormones, neurotransmitters, etc., that will kind of cause these endogenous rhythms or these circadian rhythms. But we do, in order to stay on track, we do need some kind of external stimulus that will inform us about the time of day. And that's what Zeitgeber is, which is some kind of stimulus that helps us reset our circadian rhythms, or helps us entrain a particular pattern of activity. So that's how we develop, waking up at a certain time and going and getting sleepy at a certain time. And if we don't have that external cue, then although we will still be on some kind of endogenous rhythm, or although our body will still cause us to become sleepy or still give us arousal signals, it will shift over time. So light is definitely the strongest for land animals. Food, exercise, arousal, temperature are also things that help contribute to that, to maintaining that consistent schedule. But light is definitely the strongest, and there's a biological reason for that. So you can disrupt your circadian rhythm, and the way that this happens is through phase delays or phase advances. So you can delay your circadian rhythm by traveling to an earlier time zone, like the East Coast to West Coast. And this is typically easier to adjust to. So if you're, in New York right now and you're going to go visit California, you're going to have less jet lag, essentially, if you're going to try to essentially stay awake later in California and then go to sleep and wake up in California time. So if you're, going to land in California at 9 p.m. East Coast time, that's only 6 p.m. for California, and you stay awake till 10 p.m., it'll be easier for you to adjust to that because you're gaining 3 hours of potential sleep on the next day, versus a phase advance, which is moving your circadian rhythm up by traveling to a later time zone. So going from the West Coast to the East Coast is typically harder to adjust to because essentially you're losing 3 hours of sleep. And jet lag is, potentially a very uncomfortable situation that can cause increases in cortisol, which is, again, a stress hormone. So we do have a biological regulator in the brain, obviously, and this is called the suprachiasmatic nucleus. Circadian rhythms are generated endogenously, and that is happening at the suprachiasmatic nucleus. So although it is entrained or the schedule is modulated by external cues, we still are having some kind of internal biological clock that is driving us to stay awake or go to sleep in a particular time in a circadian rhythm in a daily or a diurnal situation. So obviously that makes people think that there must be some brain region that's doing that, and it is the suprachiasmatic nucleus. And here's some evidence of that. You can see some brain tissue here, and the suprachiasmatic nucleus is down here. And you can see activity in the day and not much activity at night. So this is essentially showing that there's some kind of biological factor that's driving activity during the day here in the suprachiasmatic nucleus, and not so much at night. So the suprachiasmatic nucleus is located above the optic chiasm, which again is that part of the optic nerve in the brain that we went over in the vision lecture. It's a small branch of the optic nerve called the retinal hypothalamic path, and it innervates the suprachiasmatic nucleus and provides it with information about the time of day. So there are photoreceptors here that are sensitive to light. They have specialized retinal ganglion in this nucleus that have their own photopigment called melanopsin, and they slowly react to light. So this is different than normal photoreceptors that we didn't go over the chemical process that is occurring there, but essentially these photoreceptors in the eye are more or less immediately having a chemical reaction to light, which is causing the transduction that we talked about in sensation and perception. These photoreceptors are actually slow to react to light, so only sustained light can stimulate them, which then will stimulate the suprachiasmatic nucleus. And these are, like I said, separate photoreceptors from rods and cones. The suprachiasmatic nucleus also communicates with the pineal gland to stimulate the release of melatonin a couple of hours before typical sleep, and causes diurnal animals to become sleepy. So melatonin is a typical supplement that's used to help people go to sleep, and this is why. It's because the actual mechanism in the brain that's causing you to go to sleep or to start to get sleepy is the release of melatonin from the pineal gland. Although I don't know how much the melatonin supplements are effective. I think that this is kind of dubious about whether or not exogenous melatonin totally helps you sleep or not. But regardless, the point is that when you're getting close to sleep, the suprachiasmatic nucleus is sending signals to the pineal gland to stimulate the release of melatonin, which is going to help facilitate sleep. So sleep is kind of weird, like I already said from the beginning. It's a strange state of consciousness or unconsciousness because your brain is still being activated, and you still have certain types of consciousness in sleep, like when you're dreaming. Like that is a form of consciousness. And initially, researchers just thought that your brain was just not activated or in a lesser state of activation during sleep. But it is in itself an actual brain state. It's not death or brain death or other symptoms that are related, or not symptoms, but pathological states that are similar to brain death, like unresponsive wakefulness syndrome, which is a minimally conscious state, or a coma. It's not like that. It's its own type of brain state. So it may be helpful to go over what sleep isn't before we kind of go over the different brain states that you will be in while you're asleep. So this is a picture from a medical journal with somebody who has unresponsive wakefulness syndrome. And this used to be called a vegetative state. So individuals alternate between sleep and moderate arousal. There's no awareness of surroundings or purposeful behavior. Breathing is more regular. Painful stimuli can increase heart rate, breathing, and sweating. And eye movement occurs but does not follow a target. So this is a very strange state for the brain to be in, because individuals are essentially not conscious at all, but still have some of their normal functioning. They can they're still breathing, They still react to painful stimuli, so there's still some peripheral nervous system activity, but they don't seem to have any kind of consciousness associated with them. There's also a minimally conscious state with brief periods of purposeful action. So this is a step above a vegetative state or a unresponsive wakefulness syndrome. And also we can see here in these brain scans somebody who is in a vegetative state or has unresponsive wakefulness syndrome, and we can see that they have essentially no brain activity in the central nervous system. We then have this minimally conscious state where there is some brain activity and brief periods of purposefulness and action, but limited speech comprehension, and there is inconsistent reaction to stimuli. So they have some form of consciousness, but they do not seem to be reacting normally, but it is more activity than what you find in a vegetative state. And then we have brain death, which, well, let's just really quickly just point this out. So there's also locked-in syndrome, which I don't go over here, I don't think, but essentially locked-in syndrome is a state where individuals don't seem to be conscious. They are unable to react to certain things, but they are conscious. They can see, they can perceive what's happening in their environment, but they don't have the capacity to react to anything. So, and also we can see a lot of brain activity here, which is indicating that they have some kind of conscious awareness. So it's a very terrible situation to be in. And then obviously we have what a conscious control looks like, where we have a lot of activity here. So we can go all the way from a vegetative state, or essentially unresponsive wakefulness syndrome, where the individuals are not conscious, to a minimally conscious state, to locked-in syndrome, where they are more or less conscious but unable to react. And then we have conscious controls, obviously. And then we have brain death. And this is a really strange state to be in, because if somebody is brain dead, that means that they are dead. You know, we have kind of this other classification, which is brain death. And the reason why we have that is because technically we can keep individuals' bodies functioning. You know, we can pump their heart for them, we can breathe for them, but you know, that means that the rest of their organ systems are still getting the oxygen that they need to survive, but everything is being regulated by machines. And so if the machines are turned off, then the individual will succumb to the fact that there's no internal regulator of those organ systems. So, you know, this is something that is very hard for people to understand, because it looks like their loved one is still awake, or not awake, but alive and just asleep. And but the reality is that if it weren't for modern medicine and medical advances and scientific progress, then these people would just be dead. Their body would no longer be functioning, because if there is no activity in the brain, there is no activity that's going to be happening anywhere else. So you can essentially see here from these fMRI images what it looks like when individuals are conscious and alive versus in a coma versus total brain death. And essentially, if there is brain death, there's no coming back from that. So I think it's just really important to point out that, you know, this is another reason why it's really necessary to understand how the brain works and how the nervous system is contributing to life and consciousness. Because, you know, if you see somebody that's more or less looks like they're asleep and they're on a ventilator, then it gives you the feeling that there's a chance that they're going to wake up. But the reality is that, you know, it's as if they're decapitated. Their head is gone. The brain is gone. The brain is dead. They won't wake up. So that can be a pretty devastating situation to be in. So we have several stages of sleep. We have stage 1 through stage 4, and then we have REM, which is called paradoxical sleep. So with EEGs, you can tell the difference in brain activity that will indicate what stage of sleep somebody is in. And we can see here what the brain looks like when somebody is relaxed but awake. We can see in B here that this is stage 1 sleep, where somebody has just fallen asleep, and this stage is dominated by irregular, jagged, low voltage waves. There's less activity than relaxed wakefulness, but higher than other stages of sleep. We can see here in stage 2 sleep that this is characteristic because of these sleep spindles and K complexes. The K complex is essentially where you have this rising activity of neuronal function and then a subsequent inhibition of neuronal activity. And these sleep spindles, which we can see here, result from oscillating activity between cells in the thalamus and the cortex, and it is thought that this is related to memory consolidation. And there's actually some animal studies that look at neuronal activity. I'm not going to test you on this, but just because this is related to this, there are some animal studies where you can actually look at neuronal activity in real time with calcium imaging, where you can actually see the activation of the neuron. And essentially, when the animal's learning a task during consciousness and non-sleep, you can see those same neurons essentially being activated at a much faster rate while they are asleep. So essentially, the idea is that this stage of sleep is helping to consolidate memories. We also have stage 3 and stage 4, which are both called slow wave sleep, but have different kind of characteristic wave functions here. But in general, in stage 3 and 4, you have a decrease in heart rate, breathing, brain activity, and these low or slow large amplitude waves increase. And then we have paradoxical or REM sleep, so that's rapid eye movement. I think most people are familiar with this idea, but it's called paradoxical because of the fact that there is some similarity to when people are conscious. So you can't really tell from this trace here, but we can see when we zoom in that there is an increase in activity that kind of resembles when people are awake. And rapid eye movement is kind of a mystery. There actually isn't a good explanation for why rapid eye movement is occurring. Initially, people thought that it was a way to keep the eye lubricated, but all the stages of sleep outside of REM or rapid eye movement are called non-REM sleep. So stages 1 through 4 are all non-REM, and then we have REM. During REM, we have slow, irregular, low voltage, fast waves that indicate increased neuronal activity, which is why it's called paradoxical sleep. This is similar to stage 1, but neurons in the pons and medulla inhibit movement. So essentially, when you're asleep, you are more or less paralyzed. And this is in order, well, I mean, it's not for any reason, but it's evolutionarily adaptive to keep you from moving around. And this is why people that have sleep paralysis is because essentially they become conscious before the areas of their brain that inhibit movement are inhibited. So that's a real scary thing that can happen, where people essentially wake up but can't move. And this is because you are more or less paralyzed when you're asleep. You're not paralyzed, it's just that the pons and the medulla are inhibiting movement. So this is also associated with erections and vaginal secretion, and you have heart rate, blood pressure, breathing, and facial twitches all fluctuate during REM, and each cycle lasts about 90 minutes. And most dreaming seems to happen in REM, but can also happen in other stages of sleep. So, like I said, there's a lot of hypotheses about what REM might be for. It could be for eye health, it could be for some kind of memory consolidation, but people just honestly don't really know. So how do we wake up? Wakefulness and arousal, again, like we went over in the neuroanatomy section, is driven by the reticular formation. And you have ascending axons from the reticular formation to the brain and descending axons to the spinal cord. So we have the reticular formation over here, and essentially we have axons that are going up to the brain, and then descending axons that are going down to the spine. And the ascending axons regulate arousal by sending excitatory projections to the hypothalamus, the thalamus, the basal forebrain, and the cortex, and they release glutamate. And then we have descending axons, which mediate motor control. Stimulating the reticular formation will wake people up, or if they are already awake, will increase alertness. So we already went over this in neuroanatomy, but you'll need to know that the reticular formation is causing arousal and wakefulness. So acetylcholine can be found in the basal forebrain and the brainstem, and it sends projections all throughout the cortex and hippocampus and thalamus. So we can see that essentially this cholinergic system is sending projections all over the brain. It's important for learning, memory, and cognition, but it also promotes wakefulness and REM sleep. So acetylcholine promotes both wakefulness and REM. Norepinephrine is also really important and is located in the locus coeruleus, which is essentially this nucleus here. It stimulates arousal, it increases retention of recent memories and wakefulness, and is silent during sleep. So we can see here that the norepinephrine system is likely important for this, because when you're in REM sleep, it's basically totally inhibited, and when you're going into non-REM sleep, depending on the time that you spend in each stage, activity in these cholinergic or these norepinephrine neurons decreases. Serotonin also plays a very important role in wakefulness, arousal, and sleep. The cell bodies are located in the raphe nucleus, which we've talked about, I believe, in previous lectures. They project all throughout the cortex. So serotonin, in general, is actually a really important neurotransmitter. I think that most of us think about it in the context of like antidepressant drugs, but realistically, serotonergic neurons have a role in just about everything. And you can kind of see that because we have these dense nuclei in the raphe that are projecting everywhere. I mean, to the little brain, to the whole cortex, to the limbic system. I mean, it's like going all over the place. It promotes wakefulness and suppresses REM, and neurons are suppressed during sleep. Antidepressants increase wakefulness and suppress REM. So this is one thing that is important to know, is that essentially serotonin is going to promote wakefulness and suppress rapid eye movement sleep. Dopamine also has a role. It promotes wakefulness. So blocking dopamine equals depressant. So if you're blocking dopaminergic neurons in the VTA or the substantia nigra, then you get a decrease in activity. Parkinson's suffer from sleepiness. So people that have Parkinson's disease, that is a something we're going to go over in a neuropsychiatric disease lecture, but essentially that's a death of dopaminergic neurons in the substantia nigra. So since that is the case, these people are also tend to be sleepy. Many stimulants work through dopaminergic activity. So obviously when we have like cocaine, methamphetamine, amphetamine, Ritalin, all these drugs are either blocking dopamine transporters or reversing dopamine transporters, as we went over in our psychopharmacology lecture. So the fact that increasing dopaminergic release increases wakefulness and stimulates the nervous system is evidence that the opposite of that causes sleepiness, which is that dopamine or the lack of dopamine kind of will promote sleepiness. So histamines are actually pretty interesting. I don't know that much about histamines, but they are excitatory. They originate in the mammillary body of the hypothalamus. So essentially, here's your hypothalamus, and they are stimulating histamine release throughout the brain. Histamine levels are high during arousal and alertness, and this is why antihistamines like Benadryl or other drugs that are important for allergy relief will cause sleepiness, is because histamines are excitatory and in general are going to cause arousal. So if you have an antihistamine, you are going to get a reduction in allergy symptoms, but you're also going to become very sleepy. So we also have orexin, and which is also called a hypocretin. So these are the same neuropeptide. They are a peptide neurotransmitter that is synthesized in the lateral and posterior hypothalamus. They project the mammillary bodies and the locus coeruleus. They promote wakefulness and suppress non-REM and REM sleep. So in general, orexin and hypocretin are important for arousal. That's something you should know. They are suppressing NREM, which is non-REM, and REM sleep. They keep you awake but doesn't wake you. So if you were to stimulate orexin and hypocretin neurons, it wouldn't cause you to wake up like stimulating the reticular formation would, but it does suppress REM and non-REM if you get it stimulated before going to sleep. Narcolepsy is produced by a deficiency in this peptide. So yeah, that's super interesting. If you don't have orexin and hypocretin, then you'll just randomly fall asleep, which is what narcolepsy is, right? Okay, so moving on to the sleep promoting systems, the ventrolateral preoptic area and the medium preoptic area fire during non-REM sleep. So, from these wakefulness and arousal systems, we saw that those neurons were inhibited during sleep. But this is just the opposite. So the medium preoptic area fires just before non-REM, whereas the ventrolateral preoptic area is firing during non-REM. So this is indicating that it's helping you stay in that stage of sleep. Damage to these areas results in reduced sleep and at a poorer quality, which is very unfortunate. And GABA, which, if you remember, is the main inhibitory neurotransmitter in the nervous system, projects to the wakefulness and arousal areas. So essentially, you have GABA release, which is going to inhibit those wakefulness areas that we were talking about previously. Drugs that treat insomnia work by enhancing GABA release, which makes sense. We also have acetylcholine, which can promote REM in the lateral dorsal and preductal pontine tegmental nucleus. Drugs that enhance acetylcholine elicit intense and long-lasting REM sleep, and drugs that block acetylcholine reduce the duration of REM. So you'll notice that acetylcholine was both in the wakefulness and sleep-promoting slides, and that's because depending on the neurons that they're projecting to, it can cause either wakefulness and arousal or an increase in REM. So monoamines like serotonin and norepinephrine reduce activity to motor neurons during REM sleep, which is, again, helping with that decrease in mobility so you don't get up and start running around while you're unconscious or dreaming. GABA cells in the sublateral dorsal nucleus are also important for REM. GABA also helps to produce atonia, which again is that lack of ability to move while you're asleep. Damage to the sublateral dorsal nucleus reduces atonia and REM. So again, that's just how we know that, is that if you were to damage the sublateral dorsal nucleus, then you will move around and have less REM. So this has always kind of been interesting to me, but adenosine is a byproduct of adenosine triphosphate, which is an energy system in the body. And when you get a buildup of adenosine, it binds to adenosine receptors, which causes sleepiness. So, did I already say that? Yeah, high cellular activity results in high levels of adenosine because you're using a lot of ATP, so you're getting a lot of activity, a lot of energy use. Adenosine itself, though, reduces activity of wake-promoting neurons. So when you have adenosine receptors on some wakefulness or some stimulating neurons, adenosine essentially inhibits the activity of those cells, which is why you get sleepy. So caffeine, the way that caffeine, coffee, etc. work is by binding to those receptors to block adenosine to promote wakefulness. So essentially caffeine is an adenosine receptor antagonist, which is kind of interesting because obviously people think of, I think I may have alluded to this in the psychopharmacology lecture, but when people talk about what caffeine is doing, they think of it as a stimulant, but it's kind of like a stimulant in reverse because it is causing you to be more awake and it is causing stimulation, but the reason why it's causing stimulation is not by directly activating excitatory cells like meth or cocaine does. It is just that it's blocking adenosine receptors, and blocking adenosine receptors makes it so you're less sleepy. So essentially, these adenosine receptors are making you tired because they're inhibitory to excitatory neurons. So if you were to take caffeine and it's an adenosine receptor antagonist, then you're not going to be able to get the binding of adenosine to the receptor, which ultimately causes inhibition. So I like this mechanism a lot, so I will almost certainly ask a question about this on the exam. So just know how caffeine causes excitatory effects in the nervous system. It does it indirectly by causing the inhibition of inhibitory receptors. So the functions of sleep, is obviously rest. It decreases metabolism and conserves energy, reorganizes synapses. So there's a lot of things happening in the nervous system when people are asleep. It's thought to strengthen memories. Like I said earlier, there are preclinical rodent studies that have shown that neurons that were activated during a particular task are reactivated like repeatedly, and this is thought to be strengthening those learned experiences. And then cerebral spinal fluid recycles to remove waste. And again, like I kind of already talked about this, the functions of REM sleep, is it strengthening memories? Is it for eye health? There was some idea that, you know, the fact that your eyes are moving around really fast is to increase oxygen or flow, so you're not just sitting there drying your eyes out, which causes damage. But honestly, people don't really know what the function of REM sleep is. So yeah, I think that was a bit of a shorter lecture, not super in depth. I'm going to make a study guide so you know which things you need to know about this, but I probably am not going to ask a whole lot of questions on the exam about sleep. Obviously, we're still going to have a quiz on it, and it'll probably be around 10 questions, but yeah, this lecture is not quite as long, so it won't have as much on the exam as, you know, the psychopharmacology, or no, that was the last module, wasn't it? I think the last lecture that we did, which, oh yeah, sensation perception is going to be a huge one. I think that was like an hour and a half long. So, okay, I hope you enjoyed this and learned a little bit more about sleep, and we will see you in the next one.